Hey gang, welcome back. Glad to have you. I know last time we talked about a lot of fun stuff. We talked about loops. We've talked about drawing and rendering shapes. We've talked about a lot of cool things that help us start envisioning building out a game. Well, today we're going to get to the fun stuff. We're going to go over input and how it works and actual game loops themselves and how we can start spinning our wheels and getting into actual game development. So the first thing I want to go over is kind of like what a general game loop kind of looks like. And game loops can be a little bit different. It really depends on what your usages are. But for the most part, there's going to be a specific way that most game engines or games operate in a specific order. For example, right here, you can see how Unity does their operation. So we would need to build something similar. It's not going to be as complex, but we need to build something similar. But the game loop is the steps to make sure that everything happens in the correct order so that we don't get any issues, really. That's what it's for. So the first thing we always want to do, though, and we want to get into is getting our information, getting our data, getting our input, and that's really what this lecture is about, is getting our input. How do we do that? All that kind of fun stuff. We already talked about input as in like being able to type something in and retrieving back the string. We've talked about that, but how do we get like controller input or mouse position or just the keyboard input without having to type in a sentence and hit return to get that back? We want to get that stuff instantly. Beyond just the keyboard and mouse, we got to make sure that we understand that there's buttons already on our window. There's a minimize, there's a maximize, there's an exit, there's resizing. All those kind of things are actually considered input too, and PyGame can work with those along with your keyboard, mouse, joypads, whatever you kind of got. Those inputs matter. For PyGame, there's a couple of different ways we can do input, and this happens in almost all languages. There's event-based input, which essentially just gives you the change in state. It just gives you when the state's changed, like on a key down or an on the key release. It doesn't give you the in-between, so you have to keep track of when actually things happen. On the flip side, there is ones that give you the current state of something, so it's constantly telling you the exact state, if it's being held down or if it's not being touched at all. So you got to figure out which ones you want to use for what and why they're good for each thing. In PyGame, there's actually two different ways to even do our event-based input. You can actually pump in your queue of events and then pull out a single event if you want to, and making sure that your queue is always full and you're pulling out those individually. Or we can just use event.get and with a for loop and actually go through all our events that are happening each frame. So it's up to you which one's going to work better for you. I like to use event.get and just gather everything and then jump through a loop. It makes things flow a little bit better in my mind and how I code. So that's kind of what our examples are going to be based on today. On the flip side, though, there's also the state-based input like we were talking about. And this is like if you really want to get when you're holding down a mouse or if you're holding down a trigger on a controller and you're constantly having to hold something down, you want that exact state all the time. If you're using analog sticks and you're rotating and you need to make sure that you know if it's like 0 to 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3 based on how far that analog stick's rotated from the center, those things you'll want to know exact states, not just when it's changing. You want to make sure that you have them at all times. So you'd go into one of the modules that are provided with PyGame. They have one specific to keys, they have one specific to mouse, they have one specific to joysticks, which are essentially your controllers, your gamepads. So utilizing those and their get pressed and their get position, all those kind of functions in there, and those methods allow you to get the current state of something and not just when it's changed. We can kind of see why those would be good and bad and why we do each one. Now, if we're clicking on a menu, we probably don't need to know if we're holding down the mouse button. We just need to know when it taps down. Or if we're typing something out, we don't want to know when we're holding something down because then it would repeat. We don't want that. We just want it on change. But like I said, if we're driving in a game or we're trying to move our mouse really quickly, we want the constant state change or the constant current state and not the change in state. Other things we need to get is usually the game time. I know we talked about time before and how we can get the elapsed time of an application, but we want to get time all the time. And really the most important time we can get in a game is not necessarily the elapsed time, but the elapsed time between frames. And usually this is called delta time. And what we use this for is because a lot of different hardware runs things differently. You can have things that run really quickly, run things that run really slowly, based on the system itself. So what we can do is PyGame has this really cool thing. It's a built-in clock. It allows us to actually get the change in time between frames. We don't have to use time.time and then record that every time. We can actually use a clock object, and that clock object has a function called tick, or a method called tick, and that tick lets us know how much time since the last time we called that function is, and it keeps returning that for us. So it's a really easy way to keep track of our delta time, and we'll utilize that delta time when we're moving objects or changing things around so that we make sure everything's running at that smooth pace on every system. Now, there's another thing you can do with the clock object, and it's actually lock your maximum FPS. So if you know something you want it to run at least or a maximum of 30 frames a second, you can actually set your FPS to 30 frames a second, and you'll never run over 30 frames a second. You can still drop below that, but if you're running most PCs, you're probably going to hit that 30 frames a second if you have a decent code base. That's kind of our input gathering. We want to make sure that we're getting everything we need to make sure that we're ready for our next phase, which is actually our update phase. And our update phase allows us to update all our game objects. And Unity, it actually is called update. And that's when everything, all our magic happens. That's when our game actually starts processing things, where our character moves, where enemies start thinking and moving around, where physics collisions happen. All that kind of stuff happens in the update phase. And that's where we just put all our base code down to update our variables or update our objects. There's a big question is like, why do we do it in this order? Well, it's hard to move objects if we don't know what buttons we're pushing, right? That makes sense. So we want to get our input. If we're holding up, we want to walk forward. That makes sense. So then we get our input, then we walk forward. That's completely fine. But why do we draw or render after we start walking? Why aren't we drawing beforehand? Well, the reason is we want to make sure that our drawing or our render phase has the most up-to-date information. So we always draw last if possible, so that our state on the screen, our frame on the screen of image, is actually the current data, so it doesn't look like we're behind. If you were to draw first and then update all your stuff, you would technically see a frame behind what you're actually doing in the game. And you may want that as a feature, depending on what you want to do. Now, there's a really cool thing that happens. We talked about flipping our buffers and moving our background to our foreground so that we can see stuff. What happens is it actually switches back and forth really quick. Well, if we've already drawn the one and they're just flipping, our drawings tend to stay there. It doesn't clear itself when we actually update or flip. So we need to make sure we're doing that on our own. So one easy way to do that is whatever screen or window variable you have for your main surface, you can use the fill method and fill it with a blank color, which essentially just draws that full rectangle a single color. And I like to use black just because it's easier to draw on top of. You can use red or pink or whatever you want to use, but making sure that you clear that background out with whatever your background color is. And that way it essentially erases all the data that was already there. And then we can flip and then draw again. This way you don't have overlapping shapes. Now you may want to have overlapping shapes. Say you want to drag and paint something. Then you don't want to fill that screen up because you want to make sure it stays there. So let's go over to the computer and do some fun stuff. So we're jumping over into PyCharm again. I've got my new Py file and I'm just going to call this game loops. We've dealt with loops before. We've dealt with drawing before. So the first thing I always want to do is start my isRunning Boolean value. So isRunning. This is just an easy way to remember to get our game loops in the proper order. So isRunning equals true. We want to jump right into it. I'm just going to do while isRunning. And a cool thing we can do is we can either use our conditional equals true, or we can just say is running, because it's going to default to is this true, is this statement true. So we don't even have to say is equal to true. From there, what we want to do is we want to start getting our input in our order of things. Well, I'm going to start using comments a little bit more. So we want to go and make sure we're doing our get info and input, and then I'm going to make another state or another comment and say we want to update our variables, and then we want to render scene. And I'm going to go ahead and quit or exit. So what's the first thing we need to do? Yes, you're absolutely right. We need to import PyGame, and from there we want to go ahead and make sure that all of it is set up. So above our is running, let's just go and do pygame.init. We're just going to set up everything right now. Pygame init. Now we want to make sure we have our is running right there. I'm going to go ahead and make our clock object. So we got my game clock, and what we want to do is to go pygame.time instead of using the time modular, and then we want to go capital C for clock. Now it's capital C because it's an object. We know we're returning an object, not a variable. We know we're not running a method or a function. We're getting back an object. So we have now a new game clock. First thing I want to do is do our get info. I want to go ahead and set that delta time. So let's go ahead and do dt or delta time equals my game clock dot tick. Now what that's going to do is keep delta time updated for us, so we always have delta time. And a good thing to do, tick is actually in milliseconds. Now if we want to convert this to seconds, we divide by 1000, and it actually gives us this in seconds instead of giving it in milliseconds. That's an easy way to convert this so it's a little bit more understandable for our brain. Now we have that. Next I want to go ahead and get our events. So I want to make a new variable here, my game events, and I'm going to set this to pygame.events or event.get. This is going to give me that big list back of events that we wanted, right? Another thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and get, for this example, we want to get the mouse position. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is do my mouse, MOS for mouse, POS, we're going to get the mouse position. And what we're going to say is pygame.mouse.get_POS. And that's going to get our mouse position for us. So this should be able to get all our stuff. So in our render scene for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and do a print statement. And I'm going to say print mouse position. That's going to print our mouse position for us. And at the end of our loop, I want to go ahead and say pygame.quit. We're going to quit out our Pygame. Now we need to figure out a way to get rid of is running. We need to make sure that we know how to exit. So the easiest way to do this is in our update vars. I want to check our game events and make sure that we want to quit. So the easy way to do this is do our for event. Let's do this. Just do EVT event so we don't override our events if we ever use it before. For event in my game events. So what we do here after our for loop is we do if evt.type is equal to pygame.quit, and this is just a capital quit, not our method quit or our function quit, but at the type.quit, so it's all caps. If the event.type equals pygame.quit, that means clicking our little X button on top of our window. We want to go ahead and set is running to false. And then I want to break out of this loop, so I'm going to go break. Okay? I want to get out of our for event because we know we don't want to check any other input. We want to jump out of there. So if we run this real quick, we don't even have our window yet. That's fine, but it will get us out of our loop. So let's go ahead and set up our window. So we can do my game window equals pygame.display.set mode, and we get our resolution. I'm just going to go our 800 by 600 again. Now if we run this, we get our game window. We're constantly getting our mouse position printed out for us. So if we're at the top left, we get closer to 0, 0. We get the bottom right, we get closer to 800 by 600. And if we click our X button, our application will actually exit. Now here's some fun stuff I want to do. We got our mouse position. The printing is actually going to take a lot of information, so I'm not going to do that anymore. We're just going to get rid of that. We want to actually draw something. We want to render something. So what I'm going to do is actually do pygame.draw circle. Now it wants to take that surface again, right? So we want to give it our window, so my game window. Now we want to see what else it takes, right? Our draw takes multiple things. So there's surface, and then we want our color. So I'm going to just do red to make it really easy for us to see. Remember that there's a tuple, so 255, 0, 0. That's our red. Next it is going to take our center, so the center position of our circle. What I'm going to give this is actually mouse position. I'm going to give it the mouse position at all times. And then I want to set how big this is, our radius. So let's give it a 30 so it makes it pretty big. And our width, we can set our width as 0. That way we know it's a full circle. All right, let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Now if I'm over the screen, nothing happens because we're not updating our screen yet, remember? So go ahead and close this out. Now we need to do pygame.display.update. Now let's see what happens. We run this one more time. Our circle is on the side because our mouse button's over the side. We start moving this, and if you look, we're drawing a circle every frame, but it's continually giving us that red line because we're not filling our back buffer. We're not filling the background and overriding it. So I can actually wind up filling this whole screen with red if I want to as we run over this. And the faster I use it, the bigger spaces get between it, but eventually it's going to go all the way out. So let's go ahead and close that. All right, so we've got it where we can draw it, but we want to clear the screen. So the first thing we should probably do, my game window .fill. We want to fill it with that background color, which was black that we started with. So let's make sure we're doing that. And once we have our background color filled in right there, and we run this now we're just going to have a cool little ball that follows around our mouse. Now if we move our mouse fast, it's going to be a little bit behind because it's getting, our mouse is actually updating right before our ball is. But you can see why it would be important to make sure that we get the most current data so that it's close as possible to where we're actually at. Lastly, let's say we want to use more than just that X button. Let's say we want to use the escape key. All right, we're going to do the same type of thing. So if event.type equals pygame.key down, and then we say if evt.key equals pygame.k_escape. That's our escape key on our keyboard, so K for keyboard _ escape for our escape key. Then we do the same thing. We want to say is running and it equals false and break, and we want to tab this over for it. So if we run this now, not only can we use the X button to exit, we can actually hit our escape key on our keyboard and also exit. So I hope that helped you understand a little bit more about game loops and some input and how to draw a little bit more. And I hope that if you have questions, you jump over on the Discord and you come ask them, because I'm happy to help.